Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon and I like to talk about books and reading. Today, we're actually going to go over 10 books that I have had on my physical TBR for a very, very long time. Some of these books I've had since the late 90s, so we're talking really long time. And I figure if I call myself out and acknowledge these books have been sitting on my shelf for nearly 25 years, I can spend the next year or so incorporating these books into my reading so that I can finally check that box and say that I have read that book that's been sitting on my shelf for however many years. Most of the books are fiction. However, I do have two nonfiction, so I'll start with those. The first nonfiction book has been sitting on my shelf definitely since the late 90s. I know I obtained it in college, and that would be 2,000 Years of Disbelief, Famous People with the Courage to Doubt by James A. Haught. This is a book full of quotes from famous people who were essentially religious skeptics. You've got quotes in here from Isaac Asimov, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Sanger, George Bernard Shaw, I think even George Washington in here, just a whole bunch of information on people who basically had the courage to either publish or write down their thoughts about religion. And many of these people just either outright did not believe or were skeptical. I personally am not a very religious person. I spent a lot of time at Catholic schools when I was younger. I am definitely not someone who really believes, but I am interested in hearing from people who also did not believe. The second nonfiction book is Mary, Queen of Scots by Antonia Fraser. This thing is very thick, and I believe this is a first edition, and this was published in, when was this published? So this was published in 1969. And it came into my library in the early 2000s because I love reading about historical queens, and Mary, Queen of Scots is one of those historical queens. Antonia Fraser is one of my favorite historical authors. I have a whole bunch of books of hers, along with Alison Weir, and I picked this up with the intention of reading it right away, but I never did. And it is a thick book and really old, but it's held up really, really well. So I hope to get to this in the next year or so. And here's a picture of the author right there in pure 60s fashion. I think that's so great. It smells kind of musty. The rest of the books here are all fiction and, surprisingly enough, all classics. So the first one is Les Mis by Victor Hugo. This has been on my shelf since the early 2000s. I keep telling myself year after year I'm going to read it, especially since I've never seen the theater production, and I used to study theater and I was a performer, and it's, probably a crime for me to never have seen Les Mis. But I am seeing Les Mis this month. There's a touring company swinging through Boston, and I really wanted to read this before I saw the production. It did not happen. It just didn't happen. I just can't bring myself to get through this ginormous book. I really want to, though, because I've heard great things about it. And yeah, I just need to do it. I need to make the commitment and do it. Next, we have Sweet Francaise by Irene Nemirovsky. I apologize if I'm saying her name wrong. And I've had this edition since approximately 2007, 2008-ish. And my understanding is that Nemirovsky actually wrote this in the early 1940s, and she was captured by the Nazis in Nazi-occupied France and deported. So this story was lost for 60 some odd years and discovered in the 2000s and then published. So she did not live to see the publication of this novel. And this novel is set in Nazi-occupied France. Beginning in Paris on the eve of the Nazi occupation in 1940, Sweet Francaise tells the remarkable story of men and women thrown together in circumstances beyond their control. As Parisians flee the city, human folly surfaces in every imaginable way. A wealthy mother searches for sweets in a town without food. A couple is terrified at the thought of losing their jobs, even as their world begins to fall apart. Moving on to a provincial village now occupied by German soldiers, the locals must learn to coexist with the enemy in their town, their homes, even in their hearts. So hopefully I can get to this in the next year or so. Next, we have Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I have definitely had this since the late 1990s. I know that I acquired this while I was in college, and I've just never had the desire to really read this. I'm not a huge fan of dystopian fiction, but I do know that this is a classic, and I do know I eventually want to get to this book. Next, we have Native Son by Richard Wright. I have had this edition since the early 2000s, approximately 2007, 2008-ish. And for whatever reason, I've just never made this a priority to read. This is a classic, and I really do need to read this in the next year or so. This next book, you can't actually tell what it is because I removed the dust jacket many years ago. I went through a phase where I removed all of my dust jackets, and now I am regretting it. However, this is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Now, for many, many years, I thought the title was Far from the Maddening Crowd, not Madding Crowd, and I think it was only recently I just realized my mistake. I have had this edition since the late 90s because I obtained it in college, and one of the reasons I never prioritized reading it is because I read Jude the Obscure, and I was so traumatized by that book. I just couldn't bring myself to read another Thomas Hardy book. So I really need to get over it because I do know that Thomas Hardy is a great writer. We'll see. Next, we have Cecilia by Frances Burney, or Fanny Burney. Fanny Burney is actually a precursor to Jane Austen. She was writing in the late 1700s, and Austen enjoyed her work very much and, in fact, mentioned her in one or two of her novels. I have read a few of Fanny Burney's books. I've read Evelina. I've read Camilla. So I've read those two by Fanny Burney, but I have not read Cecilia, and this edition has been sitting on my shelves since the early 2000s. It is a thick book, and this is about Cecilia, who is an heiress and will inherit her estate only if her husband consents to take her name. So very, very interesting. I would love to get to this, especially since, female British writers from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries are my favorite. It's just, I've just never prioritized this book. This next one, I'm pretty sure might be the very oldest in my collection that I have not read. And this is a beautiful edition of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I distinctly remember when I got this. I received it in the summer of 1997. This was a gift from an employer. I had just graduated high school and I was heading off to college. And this employer that I was working for gave me 3 of these beautiful Easton Press books. He gave me Great Expectations, Jane Eyre, and The Mill on the Floss. And Great Expectations is the only one that I have not read. And look, this is just a beautiful, beautiful book. I'm not a huge fan of Dickens, and I can't really say why. It's not that I've actually disliked any of the books that I've read. I've read A Tale of Two Cities, and that's probably the one that I enjoyed the most, especially because it's such a slim little thing. I am in the middle of David Copperfield. However, I started David Copperfield like a year or 2 ago, and I still haven't finished it. I just, for whatever reason, don't have any desire to pick it up, even though I wasn't, disliking the book. I'm just not exactly sure why Dickens doesn't make me want to tear through his books. I just I don't know why. Last, we have Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. This book can kill someone. It is ginormous and very, very heavy. I have had this since the early 2000s. I've just been so daunted by this book. This was written in the 1700s, and it is in the form of letters, so it is epistolary form. Is it epistolary or epistolary? Tomato, tomato? I say epistolary. Let me know if I'm wrong, or maybe you can say it both ways. So it's written in the form of letters. Pressured by her unscrupulous family to marry a wealthy man she detests, the young Clarissa Harlowe is tricked into fleeing with the witty and debonair Robert Lovelace and places herself under his protection. Lovelace, however, proves himself to be an unworthy rake whose vague promises of marriage are accompanied by unwelcome and increasingly brutal sexual advances. And yet Clarissa finds his charm alluring, her scrupulous sense of virtue tinged with unconfessed desire. I really do want to get to this eventually. And just look at the size of it. It'll probably take me like a whole year to read it. So that is it. 10 books that I have had on my shelves unread for approximately 15 to nearly 25 years. They have survived many moves with me. So I obviously do want to read these books. Otherwise, I would have decluttered them many years ago because I moved many, many times since the late 90s when I first started actually collecting books. And hopefully I can start incorporating them into my reading in the next year or so. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining and have a great day. Bye.